Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth de Stadler. The registrar was going to do a brief introduction this morning, so I am going to do it on his behalf. Welcome to the first of our series of talks on the Protection of Personal Information Act. Today we hope to do a general overview for you and to answer any questions that you might have. As I said, this is one in a series of talks and part of a much larger project in order to assist the university in becoming POPIA compliant, which has been underway for several years now. And I will be giving you a little bit of context about that as we go along. I see Royston has joined us. Royston, I've just done a brief introduction. I don't know if you want to say a few words.
Yes, Elizabeth, I will. I'm very sorry that I've been having some difficulties. I'm in a spot where it's not easy to get Wi-Fi connectivity. So I'm sorry that I'm joining late. I will say a few words very quickly. Apologies again for joining late. And this is just to welcome the staff members who are attending this session. We really appreciate you taking the time to do so. I see we have 85, 89 attendees in the meeting thus far. So thanks very much for taking the time to attend this POPIA engagement session today. This is very encouraging because we operate from the premise that the responsibility for POPIA compliance is one that all of us have to bear. And so I'm pretty sure that today we will hear that POPIA is principle-based, and therefore compliance can never be a checkbox exercise, as we increasingly increase awareness required to implement the POPIA controls in all that we do as we work with personal information. So today's session is the first of 6 that are on offer over the next period, running from today, March, to sometime in September. And the focus today, Elizabeth, you may already have said this, is on the general overview of POPIA. So the themes for the engagement sessions between now and the 6th one in September have already been communicated through a campus-wide communique that was distributed late last week. And of course, we encourage staff members, those in the meeting, to attend each of those sessions that you think will be relevant to you, but also an appeal from me to you to please encourage colleagues in your areas, in your sphere of influence, to ask them please to join as many of the sessions as they can, mindful again of the fact that POPIA is a responsibility that all of us bear. And then Elizabeth, I know you've probably already introduced yourself, but let me just also say that you are well known in the higher education sector and beyond. You've got specialization in privacy law, compliance, risk, and you're certainly a thought leader in your area of expertise. So we are in very good hands, and over to you. Thank you very much.
There we go. I'm off mute. Thank you very much. I am going to get started. Just before I do, a little bit of housekeeping. You are encouraged to please submit your questions. So please use the chat function in order to do that. I'm going to do a sort of general overview for roughly 25 minutes, and then I hope to get to your questions because this has also been billed as a question and answer session. So without any further delay, I'm going to jump right in, and I want to apologize in advance. This is going to be a little bit dense, so a lot of information in a short time. The purpose of this session is not for you to become a specialist in POPIA, certainly, or even to understand exactly what it is that the Act requires. What I want to achieve with today's session is to ensure that everybody understands when the legislation applies, right? So all we are looking for right now is to understand when does this legislation apply and have a very basic understanding of what it is that it requires of us. The registrar has mentioned that this is a set of principle-based, it's a principle-based piece of legislation, and that is the truth. And it makes it very difficult for organizations to comply because there is no checklist or boxes that we can tick. We really need to understand that this legislation is about assessing our activities and then bringing in some controls, as risk people would call it, or safeguards, in order to ensure that what we are doing is not just lawful in terms of the legislation, but is also ethical. Increasingly, when we talk about the use of personal information, what we are allowed to have, what we're allowed to use it for, this is more of an ethical inquiry. And so many of you might also be more experienced in questions of ethics, and that is should be really comforting, because you will find a lot of what I'm about to say quite familiar. Ethics also is not a list of do's and don'ts. It's very, very context specific. Right, so we're first going to just talk about some events that have taken place. So as I've mentioned, UCT is certainly not new to POPI, and POPI is no longer new. For 10 years, we had to talk about POPI as if, you know, it's new, or it was still going to come into force. And that, of course, has happened. So we can't say that POPI is new anymore. And there are quite a few things that are happening both at UCT and then in the broader higher education sector. So first off, obviously, we are here today because POPI came into force last year. It came into force on the 1st of July. And so we are very rapidly nearing its 1-year anniversary. What happened on the 1st of July? The information regulator got their powers. And so not surprisingly, we have found, not luckily at UCT, but at other organizations, that increasingly organizations are coming under the scrutiny of the information regulator. It's not necessarily anything to be afraid of, but it is something that we need to be prepared for. The information regulator now has about 100 employees and certainly have been more active and more well-funded than any of us expected, you know, in the last decade that would happen. So we do have an active regulator, but that is not the time when POPI bothers us the most. So we also increasingly under scrutiny from other organizations with whom we collaborate or with whom we share information. And so we are often asked to show that we are POPI compliant, and that is, of course, the challenge that the POPI team is grappling with at the moment. Is so what do we need to put in place in order to make the university compliant, or as compliant as possible? Full compliance is not possible, and so UCT responded as one does with these kinds of endeavors by approving a data privacy and protection policy. The university also has other policies that contribute towards POPI compliance, but this privacy and data protection policy is brand new. It's been approved on an interim basis because we expect that the policy will evolve as we implement it. And so today's session is an example of how we are going to work towards ensuring that people actually follow this policy. And then lastly, I have to mention that there is a POPI code of conduct coming. A code of conduct, once accredited by the information regulator, has equal status to POPI, the law, and so the university will have to follow it. It will cover all research activities. There is another session, as Royston mentioned. There are other sessions, and the very next one is going to be for researchers. So for those of you who are specifically interested in that aspect of POPI, in May, there is a session dedicated to it. But of course, I'm more than happy to answer any burning questions that you might have, even though we will have that session. The ASAF code will circulate for comment again in April, so also be on the lookout for the draft, but certainly ASAF is hoping to accredit that code before the end of the year. In the meantime, though, we can't say, well, the code has not been accredited, so there's nothing we can do yet, even in research, because POPI still applies. POPI will always apply. There is a very useful document. It is a guide to the protection of personal information, specifically in the higher education industry. This is not a code of conduct, it's a guideline, but it does give quite useful guidance on how to apply these principles that can be quite vague or opaque in a higher education setting. And so this document is also available on our POPI information page, or you can access it via the University South Africa page. I've already mentioned the ASAF code. It will also be published in journals, but it will be circulating at the university in the next couple of weeks. Right, so this brings us to POPI basics. Right, so what is this piece of legislation about? And many of you have been to sessions before, and you might be thinking, oh, not this again. But it bears repeating, because if we do not understand the scope of the legislation, we are going to miss things, because we are going to think that POPI doesn't apply in certain contexts when it actually does. So this is incredibly important, and why we are repeating this message so many times. So I'm going to talk about the basics, just the scope of the legislation, and then I am going to talk about what these principles actually are and give you some rules of thumb for when you should be worried. And if you end up being worried at the end of my soliloquy, you should raise your hand, or rather put your questions in the chat, and we will gladly try and take that worry off your shoulders, or make you more worried. That's an occupational hazard. Right. So the most important concept to understand is, what is personal information? The Act is called the Protection of Personal Information Act, after all. So its scope is determined by whether you are doing anything with personal information. And on the slide there, you can see a list of, some of them are rather obvious, some are perhaps less obvious. But POPI applies to any information that can be related back to an identified or identifiable individual or organization, right? So it's not just information that is identified. In other words, I can see whose information it is. Elizabeth got 49% in privacy law. It's also, it can also apply to information where you can't necessarily see that it is Elizabeth who got 49% from the record itself, but let's say there are only 2 people who took privacy law. All of a sudden, it becomes quite likely that the information can become identifiable. Right? In other words, there are methods to identify that information, and this is very important. So even if it doesn't look like it is identified information, the context can sometimes make information identifiable. But it is a very, very good safeguard to anonymize or to pseudonymize information whenever you can. In other words, if you don't need the information in an identified form, make it pseudo-anonymized. In other words, you can re-identify it, but your random person can't see who that information relates to. Right, so this is incredibly important. If you've got any questions regarding what is or is not personal information, please feel free to pop it in the comments, and I will, in the chat, and I will answer those. Immediately now, you start thinking about this personal information that is everywhere. There are very few staff members at the university who will not at some stage come into contact with personal information of someone else, right? So who are these people whose personal information a university, and certainly this university, comes into contact with? This is another way of figuring out, when does POPI apply, or who does it apply to? And the answer becomes apparent very quickly. It applies to most parts of the university. It applies to all faculties. It will apply to many of the sort of support services that the university renders. So first and foremost, we have to think about the privacy of students. They are, after all, our clients. And if we lose them, if they don't trust us, we're going to find it very difficult to function as a successful university. We have to think about the entire life cycle of the student, right? So we get students who apply to come to UCT. We have to collect a lot of personal information. Some of them will be successful, some of them won't, some of them will register, some of them won't. And then eventually, hopefully, many of them will graduate and they become alumnus of the university, and POPI will apply to that entire life cycle. Similarly, when we talk about personal information of employees, whether that is a full-time employee or someone who works on a contract basis, people will apply for positions. Some will be successful, some will take up their employment, and some will work until they retire or leave the employment of the university for another reason. And we have to protect information throughout that life cycle. Then we've got research participants, both current and historical. We've got affiliated organizations. So POPI is very strange. It also protects the privacy of organizations. There are only a handful of countries in the world that does that. But if you think about it, the personal information of organizations often contains a lot of personal information about individuals in any event. So we have to think about our partners, our collaborators, our service providers, our suppliers, and other entities that we work with to achieve our purposes as a university. And then there are other individuals that are, it's a little bit more, how can I put it? These are no, they come and go usually, but we have to think about them as well. It's from family members of students, employees, sureties, emergency contacts, visitors, and members of the public. We do collect personal information when they come to campus or when they participate in various activities. Right. So again, if you process the personal information of any of these individuals or organizations, you will be affected by POPI to some degree. Okay, so this is now time for a very important point, and this is really, if you take nothing away apart from these two slides and what I'm about to say next, I would consider today's session a success. POPI does not make anything illegal. There is nothing that is illegal in terms of POPI, right? So just because you use personal information does not mean that you are now in trouble. About 80% of what most organizations do with personal information is entirely justifiable. Many of them did not have to do all that much in order to become POPI compliant. But what we do have to do is we have to assess what we do against these principles. And I'm going to talk about what they are in a moment. But this image is a way of organizing them. So we've got the when POPI applies is whenever we process the personal information of anybody, really. And it applies to when we say processing, which lies at the heart of POPI. It's any activity that is undertaken with personal information, where that personal information is created, collected, used, shared, transformed, stored, or destroyed. Right? So start thinking about what are these activities. I think of them as activities. An activity might be deciding whether a specific candidate will be admitted to the university or not, right? And when we look at POPI, we organize the rules sort of in three categories, and you'll see the three just now again. On the outside layers, there's information security, and we have a specific session on information security coming up later in the year. On the inside, we have what is called the information life cycle, which starts when we collect or create information, and it ends when we decide to permanently archive or destroy information. And there are two components here. The first one is privacy. In other words, what information is the university entitled to have, and what can the university do with that information? Who can we share that information with? Can we later on use it for some new purpose? And then at the end of our relationship with the data subject, so when a student becomes an alumni, or an employee becomes a former employee, or a service provider becomes a former service provider, what is the information that we're going to keep as a record? What information can we let go of or destroy, right? And that is where records management comes in, right? So here are those three categories, just with a different picture, and this is where the policies come in, right? So privacy is about what information are we entitled to have and what can we use it for and how. Records management is about, at the end of our relationship with the data subject, with a student, with an employee, with a service provider, what do we keep, what do we let go of? And then information security is about how do we ensure that this information does not get into the wrong hands or is disclosed to people who are not authorized to see it? Or how do we make sure that no one can tamper with the information? And how do we make sure that that information is always available to people who have a legitimate need to see or to use that personal information? And that is information security in a nutshell, the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay. And the good news is that UCT already has all of these policy principles in place. We are still reviewing the records management policy, but the basics is there. The information security policy was approved now 2 or 3 years ago already, and we've got this interim data privacy and protection policy that has been approved as well. So the framework is in place, but we now have to implement it. So what does implementation mean? A policy is just a piece of paper. Implementation means that we are going to assess our environment and all of our existing procedures or processes or activities, it doesn't matter what you call it, and make certain changes. And we are going to think about our behavior, right? So there are two types of changes to how you work when it comes to POPIA compliance. The one is where we have to fundamentally change an activity, the way something is done, and that takes quite senior staff members to make those decisions about how we are going to do things in future. But there's also a second category of change, and that is changes to behavior. Right? These are things that are not governed by a set process or procedure. It's not an activity that is defined. It is you going about your day-to-day work at the university, and what are these behavioral changes that we need to be on the lookout for. And I'm going to highlight some of them, but certainly we will be talking about them later in the year as well. So be on the lookout for these subtle changes to your own behavior that only you can achieve, because that is what we need from all UCT staff members. And I'll talk about roles and responsibilities towards the end. Okay, so let's break it down. Let's talk a little bit about the principles. And again, I apologize. I know it is a lot of information, and so I don't need you to remember all of these. I need you to remember that, again, nothing is illegal in terms of POPIA. It's about balance. And what are we balancing? On the one hand, people have a right to privacy. And that right to privacy means that they have a right not to be intruded upon. They have a right to decide or have control over who knows personal things about them. But that right is not unlimited. And that's why nothing that we do with personal information in all likelihood is downright illegal. We also, as an institution, have the right to function effectively. Right? So if what we are doing with personal information is necessary in order to achieve our purposes, and if it is proportional, in other words, the way in which we are doing it balances the right to privacy with whatever purpose we need to use the information for, we will be okay, right, in terms of POPIA. So that is POPIA in a nutshell. Is what I'm doing with this personal information necessary for some legitimate purpose that I have to achieve as a university or as a staff member at the university? And is it proportional? Am I doing it in the least intrusive way possible? So you will see all of the principles are aimed at ensuring that what we do is proportional, that we go, is this the least intrusive way in which we can achieve our purposes? Right, so how do you achieve this balance? How do you spot the times where what we're doing is not proportional? And this is where the principles that are listed in POPIA comes into play. So here are a couple of rules of thumb. And then I have some slides that gives a little bit more detail for you, those of you who won't lose the will to live in the next 5 minutes. Right, so the first principle is less is more. Right, so you must always collect the least amount of personal information that you need in order to do what you need to do. I have never ever found a form anywhere that I could introduce. In other words, we ask for information out of habit, not because we actually use it for something. So you should be asking yourselves, why am I requiring this personal information? Why am I processing it? Can I achieve this purpose without processing it at all, or by processing less? The second principle is no surprises. Right? Nothing that we do must happen in secret. There must be a notification to the data subject that explains what personal information we are asking for, why, and who it will be shared with. This is called a privacy notice, and the university is in the process of publishing a whole set of privacy notices to achieve this purpose. But when you find yourself collecting or creating personal information, you have to ask yourself, have I pointed the data subject to these privacy notices? And typically that's done by through a privacy statement, something to the effect of, we need to collect your information in order to provide you with whatever service it is that we're providing them with. If you want more information, go read the privacy notices that can be found on this page. And so be on the lookout for communication about that. We need to make very sure we don't share personal information with just anybody. When we are sharing personal information with third parties, preferably there should be a contract in place, and we should be sure that they understand that they can only use the personal information for certain purposes and that they must keep it safe from unauthorized eyes. If you are feeling uncertain, that is natural, and that is also why the POPIA team is here, is if you are feeling like, okay, this might be inappropriate, you're probably right. We are all born with sort of an innate sense of what is or is not ethical when it comes to personal information, because we all have personal information. So I encourage everybody to exercise that empathy. And then if you are feeling uncomfortable, to listen to that discomfort and get in touch with us so that we can either help you dispel it or change the way in which you process information to where you are comfortable, but don't ignore that sense of discomfort. If you don't have a use for personal information, don't collect it. If a lot of unnecessary personal information is lying around, we should talk about how we might get rid of it. So that's the use it or lose it principle. When we do decide to destroy it, and that's why you should seek advice, it's not as easy as pressing delete very often. So we need to make sure that we don't actually disclose the information in the destruction process. That happens very, very often. But above all, keep the information safe. So don't leave it lying around. Think of it as something very precious that you don't want to share, unless there's a very good and compelling reason why the information should be shared. So what do all of these things mean? I've created a couple of slides just to give you some idea of the questions that we would ask should you ever ask us to assess a process. When there are multiple organizations involved, we always go looking for a contract. We are always documenting compliance. In other words, when we process personal information, the university is now required to keep a paper trail. So we need to be able to say, let's say we are investigated and we need to look at how stuff was done with personal information a year ago. How do we do that? Well, it's going to be difficult if it's not documented, which is why POPIA requires it. So if you're doing something sort of informally, think about documenting the process. We need to know what we are using personal information for. That should also be documented. In other words, we can't collect personal information just in case, or in case we need it, hypothetically, or for purposes that are unknown to us. We need to have a purpose. And with that comes a legal basis. So if what we are doing is necessary for the operation of the university, we will have normally a legal basis. It's when we are doing strange things with personal information that we could get into trouble there, but that's fairly rare. But it's very common that people don't know what the purpose is for which they're collecting personal information. And that brings me to the next one. If you don't know why you're collecting personal information, you won't know what personal information to collect. And this is the most important principle in POPIA. It's why I put less is more first in my rules of thumb. So rules of thumb, right, is we need to work lean. We need to work with as little personal information as possible. That protects the university, it protects the data subject, it makes us more cost efficient, it decreases the overall risk. The best way to get into a lot of trouble is to be caught with a lot of personal information that you are not actually using. That's the best way for the university to get into a lot of trouble, because that is unnecessary risk. It's disproportional. So that, is it necessary? Is it proportional? Those two words are very, very important. Then we have to be careful where we get personal information from. Any activity where we are getting personal information from a source other than the student, the employee, or the visitor, or whoever, if we're getting information from credit bureaus or data brokers or the internet, that will be high risk. We need to make sure that that information is reliable. And that it is legal for us to get information from that source. We need to be transparent. So that's where the privacy notices come in. So we need to ensure that what we're doing, all of what we're doing is represented or stated in the privacy notice, but also that we make people aware of them. We need to make sure that the information that we have is of a good quality. In other words, if you are finding yourself battling against incorrect personal information all the time, that is a sign of trouble, and we would appreciate it if you brought it to our attention so that we can assess and advise whether we need to do something about it. But bad or information that is of a poor quality also makes processing it very, very expensive. Right? So this is also where we can save the university a lot of money. We can make the university more efficient, is to look after the quality of our information, making sure that we've got, as they say, one version of the truth, which is referred to as master data management. In other words, if I want to know something about a student, there's one place I go and look at it. If a student wants to update their information, it's easy for us to update it because it's only kept in one place. We need to limit sharing. This is where most of the trouble comes from. Most incidents at the university or at universities that I have come across that gets them into trouble is where we share information when it's not justified, or we share information by accident. There is probably not a person in this training today that has not accidentally sent an email to the wrong person. If that email contained personal information or an attachment, let's say an Excel spreadsheet, and this is a true story, luckily not at UCT, someone emailed accidentally a spreadsheet with the contact details and student numbers of thousands of students to incorrect recipients, that is a notifiable security compromise. What that means is UCT would have to report that this has happened to the information regulator. Let's sit with that for a moment. That's how easily this happens. And it's almost always a legitimate attempt to share it. We've just shared it with the wrong person, or we've shared more information than was required. Don't share the whole payroll file if someone just needs access to 7 records, another real example, right? So, but again, not from UCT. So we have to be extremely vigilant when we share information. There is nothing that we can do from a centralized basis, apart maybe from banning sending personal information via email, to ensure that staff do not send accidentally, emails to the wrong recipient. That, by and large, for the moment at least, is your responsibility. When you are sending personal information, you have to be hyper vigilant and very, very careful. If we are sharing with third parties outside of the university, we do need to make sure that there's a contract in place. Sometimes POPIA requires it, but in other times it's just prudent, just to ensure that we've got a paper trail of where we told them what they can use this personal information for, what are the controls we expect them to put in place, and where they can undertake to keep the information secure. There are instances where UCT can be held accountable or responsible by the information regulator for the conduct of other organizations. So that is why we need to make sure that when we share information with third parties, and there are many, many legitimate reasons why we need to do that, that we have set our expectations about how they will treat that information so that we cover ourselves if something does go wrong. Then we need to keep information secure. It is very common for people to think information security, that's the hackers and the cybersecurity, and IT is taking care of that. Again, a lot of these breaches have their root cause in behavior. So you do need to think about your own, what we call sort of information security hygiene. Your passwords, whether your operating systems and your software has been updated. I expect if I ask the question now, whose cell phone is entirely up to date when it comes to all of the upgrades and things, most of you will say, no, as I sit here, there is an upgrade that I have not installed. So that's very normal, but it's something we need to be aware of. We also need to cover ourselves by using university-approved technology when we work. We know from bitter experience that this is very common, that people use technology, their own accounts, for instance, and that makes it harder to protect personal information and to preserve it. But keep just in the front of your mind, personal information is confidential. It is like, imagine, and this is something we may want to achieve over time, if a document or a file contains personal information, it is stamped confidential with one of those bright red stamps. So how do you treat confidential information? Very carefully, right? You don't leave it lying around. You keep control over who has access to it. So you don't just save it anywhere. You think about these things. Being conscious of them is the first step. And if you need any advice on how to do something, that is what we're here for today, but also just in general, there is a popia@uct.ac.za email address, which you can use if you are uncertain at all about how to keep personal information safe, and how to ensure that only people who need access to it have access to it. Right. Records management, making sure that we don't keep everything forever, because that would be very, very expensive. But that decision of letting go of information is probably above the pay grade of many people listening today. So what you need to think about more is actually the opposite, preserving information. How do we make sure that, for instance, when you retire, you don't walk out of the university with a lot of information under your arm that no one else at the university has? So how do we preserve information? Again, if you're using your own personal Dropbox account to do work, university can't preserve that Dropbox account. Right, so it's about the preservation of information. A lot of people make this about deletion, but actually it's more about keeping information so that we have a reliable record of events and decisions and what happened on a day-to-day basis. And there is a very long list of legislation that applies to universities that actually requires us to keep that record. So for the moment, don't think too much about destroying information. And certainly don't do it without checking very carefully whether you are authorized to destroy it. Rather think about how do we preserve information? How do we, again, keep it safe and make sure that the university's got a reliable record of its existence. And then lastly, data subjects. So those are the students, the employees, the research participants, everybody whose personal information we have, they have rights. If someone tries to exercise their data subject rights, it means usually that they are already angry at us. It means that they already feel somehow hard done by. So it means that these data subject requests need to be treated with a lot of care. Sometimes the answer is going to be a respectful no, but no when someone tries to exercise any of these rights. So asking questions like, what information do you have about me? Can I have access to a record of personal information? I demand that you delete all of the personal information you have about me. Incidentally, we hardly ever can. We're hardly ever allowed to delete. Please correct my information. That's sometimes the easier one. If it's incorrect and we trust that individual, we can correct it. But sometimes the person wanting to correct the information will be a bad guy. One of my favorite tests for organizations is whether I can, for instance, phone a human resource administrator and change someone's bank account details on the payroll to my own. I've done this a couple of times, right? So don't just trust anybody who's correcting personal information because they might be trying to steal, right? So none of these rights are straightforward. And so when you receive one, you should escalate it to the POPIA team so that we can respond to it properly, because it's often a precursor to further action or to a complaint, right? So we need to be very careful. We need to recognize these moments when they happen, and then send it to the right people, which at this stage is the POPIA team, right? So you may also think, oh, I have these rights. I have exercised my data subject rights with great effect in the last couple of months. For one thing, at one point, a laboratory kept sending me trying to demand payment for the incorrect invoice. So I used my POPIA rights in order to correct the record and to get them to respond quickly. They thought I was a 67-year-old woman in Goodwood with a heart condition. So they are very, very effective, and you all have them because all of us share personal information with organizations on a daily basis. Right, so we need you, but we also support you. There are a team of people in the POPIA team, that's that pink dot, but as you may have realized now, this is actually a team sport. We need every single individual at the university who works with personal information to be aware of when to approach the POPIA team and to moderate your behavior to keep information safe. Here is just a quick summary of the responsibilities of these various role players, and then I'm going to get to your question. So we've got an information officer, it's the Vice Chancellor. That's how serious this is. This was set by POPIA itself. The head of the organization is the information officer and is accountable sometimes, rarely, but sometimes personally. UCT has appointed 3 deputy information officers, the registrar, the DVC research, and the COO. And they are responsible for much of the day-to-day work, and they are supported by the POPIA team, which is made up of various staff members at UCT, as well as some external consultants, of which I am one. The primary responsibility to implement any policy in their area lies with the deans and directors, and so we will be embarking on various campaigns in order to assist them in making these policies come to life in their areas. This is a task, a very big task, and will take several years to implement. but you can expect to see some activity there. And then employees and even students from time to time. What we need you to do is not only to correct your own information, there are only 90 odd, last time someone said something, people in the session, so we do need you to also spread the word to other people when you notice that they are engaging in behavior that might be high risk. We need you to ask for advice. At this point, a sign of success of the POPI program will be measured in how many questions we get. If we get a lot of questions, we know we are being successful. If we don't get any questions, that is a very, very bad sign. So please ask for advice. If your question is not answered today, or if you think of questions later on, at any point, you can email us and we will assist you. If you think something has gone wrong, you need to report it immediately. It's human nature. When something has gone wrong, like a couple of weeks ago, I accidentally fell for a spear phishing attack. It's where someone was impersonating one of my clients and sent me an email with a link in to download a proof of payment. And it was spear phishing because the person on the other side knew that I was expecting payment. They hacked someone's inbox and I clicked on it. I work with this stuff every day and I clicked on it. So, and in that moment, when I realized about 3 minutes later, that I have now done something stupid, I was faced with a choice. I can either keep it to myself because I don't think anything seriously happened, or I could follow our process and use our WhatsApp group to notify our information security specialist. And I was tempted not to do anything because I know that it's going to be a lot of admin and I might even get into trouble and I might even be ridiculed by my colleagues for falling for something that we do training on, but I did it. Right. So what I want to say today is not reporting an incident and something bad does happen will always get you into trouble. Making a mistake is human, right? And we will work to assist you to minimize the harm to the organization and to yourself. So please, when you suspect you've done something silly, tell us and we can help you, but we can't help if we don't know about an incident, and we expect them to happen every day. And then participate in training. I'm preaching to the converted, but some of you might have people who work for you. Encourage them to ask for training or attend the existing training sessions, but we are more than willing to come and do other sessions as well. All right, so what are you worried about now? I should hopefully see some questions. Veronica, I don't know if you're going to share questions with me in the Q&A, I'm assuming. I'm waiting for it to load.
Yes, please look under the tab for published.
Okay, we start off with, there we go. Just scrolling to the top, right. Someone has asked, are there circumstances where POPI does not apply? What rules or regulations or law, for that matter, supersede the POPI Act? Okay, so POPI is superseded only by the Constitution. There are pieces of legislation that, so the first part of your question is, are there cases where POPI won't apply? Yes, if information is completely anonymized, there is no reasonably foreseeable method through which anybody can re-identify it, then POPI does not apply. We often see partially anonymized information. We don't often see fully anonymized information. Very often it can be re-identified, but if you are confident that this information has been aggregated, there's no way in which individuals can be identified, POPI will not apply. So a lot of statistical analysis happens on that basis. A lot of research, although it starts with information being collected from research participants, the research later becomes completely aggregated or fully anonymized and can therefore be published, etc., without worrying too much about POPI. The second part of the question is whether sometimes we can ignore POPI in favor of other legislation, and the answer is no. POPI is almost like now the Constitution, because in the Constitution in section 14 we've got the right to privacy, but again that right's not absolute, and essentially POPI says these are the instances, if these principles are followed, you can limit someone's right to privacy, you can use their personal information. But there are other pieces of legislation that tells us to do things with personal information. So, such as labor legislation, there are regulations to the Higher Education Act that requires, for instance, that we collect certain information about students. There's employment equity legislation, there's BEE charters, there's a whole host of financial regulations around, what information we must keep about our vendors and service providers, and we must follow those pieces of legislation until someone challenges them for being unconstitutional, if that is the case. So yes and no. POPI is the sort of constitution when it comes to processing of personal information, but where other legislation directs us to do things, we must do them. We must comply with those laws. If we feel that those laws are in and of themselves unconstitutional, we must challenge them. But while they stand, we must follow them. Right. Collating names, staff numbers, and ID for training. Is this allowed? So in terms of various skills development policies and legislation, we need to report on the training that we give to staff. So insofar as it is necessary to achieve that purpose, yes, you can collate the information, but think about whether you can do it. What is the most or the least invasive way to do it? I often see these training registers that says, write your name, your ID number, your employment number, your race, your gender, and then sign here. That's not necessary, right? So you really, to compile those reports that need to go to the department, you need to know name and maybe employee number, just to verify it in case there are two Elizabeth de Stadler. So minimize the amount of information that you recollect. You already have the information about a person's race and gender and the ID number and those things. So if you only need the employment ID, then do that. With new legislation signed into effect this week regarding employers being able to find out vaccination status from employees, what role does POPI play? Does this not nullify the purpose of POPI, which aligns itself with the Constitution? What is its purpose if it can simply be sidestepped in certain instances, and who determines what those instances are? It does not provide proper protection to the individual. So the right to privacy, just like any constitutional right, is balanced against other public interests, such as public safety, right? So how this works is when regulations are made under the Disaster Management Act by the various departments, because it invades privacy, those regulations get checked by the information regulator. And very often in the last 2 years, those regulations have been changed as a result of that. So the regulations get checked even before they are made. Again, if there is a piece of legislation or a regulation that has been passed properly that says employees have the right to know what your vaccination status is, then that right will stand as a justifiable limitation of the right to privacy because it is balanced against sort of your right to occupational health and safety, right? So that is a very contentious issue. A lot of people believe that privacy should trump the health considerations here, and I completely understand, but that assessment has been done by government, and for the moment it's come out in favor of disclosing the vaccination status. Of course, where POPI comes in is in how that vaccination status information is stored and what it can and can't be used for. If there is the feeling that this is unconstitutional, obviously anybody is free to challenge the constitutionality of the regulations. In fact, this one is already being challenged, and so the Constitutional Court will act as the final arbiter. But this is a very good example of how privacy often gets waived in favor of public safety. Particularly in emergencies. Now, of course, there's also a rising debate on whether the COVID pandemic is an emergency that justifies this erosion, but that is perhaps a debate for a different day. Right, our school participates in international rankings and national surveys where we collect information on students and faculty, gender-sponsored students, and race. The information is sometimes non-mandatory for admissions or HR when onboarding, but leaves gaps when we collect information for current students and faculty. Is there a way of making it mandatory for students to provide certain information so that it makes our data collection more accurate? Right, so if the information is necessary in order to perform in terms of our contract with the students, so in order to provide a high quality education to them, then it can be mandatory. If there is a piece of legislation that requires that we collect the information, then it can be mandatory. If it is necessary for the university to exercise a public function as a public body, it can be mandatory. And if there is a very, very compelling interest of UCT or another organization that compels us to collect this information, we can also make it mandatory. But for the last two, so if there's no contractual or legal reason why we are gathering the information, it is in the public interest, or it is because we have a compelling legitimate interest in collecting the information, the student has to be given the right to object. So you can make it mandatory, but some students may want to object. And we often see this in respect of race. But now race is also special personal information. So there is a limited list of information that's considered special. It's not necessarily more sensitive. Race is one of them. Health information is one of them. Information about ethnic origin, political persuasion, philosophical beliefs. All of that is considered special personal information. In that case, there has to be a law that compels you to collect that information, or a legal reason why you collect that information. Or it can be for research, right? So there are any number of reasons why information collection might be mandatory, but in certain instances, a person has the right to object. And so if you want us to review a form to check which fields you can make mandatory and which must remain voluntary, please send it to us and we will gladly do so. Will our position descriptions be reviewed in view of the POPIA-related rights and responsibilities? The new PD template, which I'm not sure what that is, has a section for scope of responsibility.
I think, Elizabeth, it's about our job descriptions, if POPIA is now going to be formally included into our job description.
In certain instances, yes. So all of us, regardless of job description, have the responsibility to comply with UCT policies. That is in your letter of engagement. So when there is any internal policy, you must comply with it. Obviously, that is said under the assumption that you are made aware of that policy and then receive training. So for some people, the impact of POPI will be light. For others, it will impact the way in which they perform their tasks, in which case it is for the leadership responsible for that task to then amend how that task is performed so that it's done in a POPI compliant way. So for some people, I would say yes, it might justify an amendment to the job description, but we would not normally do that every time there's a new piece of legislation. We amend internal policies, and it's in everybody's job description to comply with internal policies when it requires them to change their behavior. Otherwise, we'd be changing KPIs every 5 minutes. So insofar as this is now, there are now new policies, and some of it requires that we treat personal information with more care than perhaps we have in the past. I would say yes, but it's not necessarily something that has to be written into a job description. Certainly for people who have very specific duties that will require significant additional time from them, then we would look at changing job descriptions, but not just for the general behavioral aspects. How are constitutional rights not the line in the sand? Why the caveats or limitations when it comes to the protection that it guarantees? It is my understanding that a constitution exists to protect the rights of the individual. This is one's only true empowerment in society. It's quite a long question, so I'm going to stop there and just answer this so long. So none of the rights of the human rights in the Bill of Rights are guaranteed. There is a section in the Constitution, section 36, that says that constitutional rights or human rights can be limited when it is necessary and proportional to do so. Section 14 guarantees the right to privacy, but it has always been part of constitutional law that right might sometimes have to take a backseat to other rights, such as freedom of expression, such as public safety and health, etc. So there are many, many reasons on a daily basis why human rights get limited. POPI was then enacted in order to create a set of principles to guide organizations to determine when it is justifiable to use personal information. Every time we use personal information in some way, we are infringing on a person's privacy, but none of us have the absolute right to privacy. Otherwise, it would make the country ungovernable and no organization would be able to perform their function. It is when what we're doing is disproportionate or unnecessary, too invasive. That is when POPI will say you need to change the way in which you are processing personal information, or otherwise it is considered unconstitutional. But every single constitutional right, the right to equality, the right to dignity, all of those rights are limited on a daily basis, and there is a weighing up exercise that happens to ensure that that limitation is necessary and proportional. If you feel that conduct is not necessary or proportional, or if you even feel like another piece of legislation is not necessary or proportional, they get challenged in court every day. And so you can lodge a complaint with the information regulator and they will investigate the conduct. But this is a justifiable limitation of privacy, I would say, or often it is a justifiable limitation. But of course, there are fringe cases where it is not justifiable. We provide student results to funders and sometimes ask for donations from corporates. They ask for personal information about these students. So they are funded in line with their program of study and racial and gender categorization. If a student's in need of funding and has asked for support, must we get a declaration from the student that their personal information will be shared? Yes, so often the sharing of some personal information is part of the conditions for the funding, and that will be justifiable in terms of sometimes the contract with the student, so the funding contract with the student or the university on behalf of the student. And sometimes it will even be driven by legislation, because these corporates that provide donations can get a tax break under certain circumstances, or can get BEE points allocated to them. So there are legal reasons why, if you want the funding, you need to provide some personal information on progress, or at the very least to see whether you qualify for the funding in question. There are worse and better ways of doing this. So very often, for instance, if a funder says, well, this funding is only available to students that meet a certain demographic, then the university will go find those students and say, these students meet your requirements, instead of sending them a database of students and they select the ones that meet their requirements. That's one example of how we might do it in a less invasive way, and always making sure that we only share the information that is necessary and proportional for the goal in question, which in this case is funding the students. So the short answer to your question is yes. We're not necessarily framing it as we're asking for your permission to share the personal information. We are informing you that because you indicated that you require funding, your information will be shared with these people. And this is the information that will be shared, and this is why it will be shared. So that is part of the transparency principle. I am absolutely elated at the number of questions. I think that we are going to run out of time, and so Veronica and I will definitely answer these questions in writing as well. So that is that possible, Veronica? So we can make them available, the ones that we don't get to.
Yes, and the attendees need to join the team, the POPIA Information Guide team, and we'll post it there with the recording.
Yeah, we will post all of this on the POPIA information teams with a recording, as well as there is a written Q&A that we will add these to. I am more than happy to carry on for the moment. I understand if some of you have to leave. Veronica, can we carry on for another couple of minutes? And Garth, maybe you guys can just tell me, or is it a hard stop?
It's a hard stop.
Okay. We got through quite a few of the questions. There are one or two that I would have liked to answer. I encourage everybody to please join the POPI teams. As Veronica has said, please send any other questions that you might have to popia@uct.ac.za. Here it is. And we will answer all of these questions in writing, even the ones that we have already answered, because I do think the entire community can benefit from it. And as I said, I'm elated at the number and the quality of the questions that we are receiving. And all that remains is for me to thank you for your time and participation today. And we will be in touch, and hopefully we will see you at the sessions that are still coming. For those of you who wonder what they are, here we have them. The sessions that are still coming later in the year. Thank you.